Hey guys, hey, sorry I'm late for the coup d'etat. Anyway, how long do we have to stand here like this for? I got another coup I gotta be at in like an hour. Several coup d'etats around the African continent threaten to spiral out of control into a much wider conflict. Niger's elite presidential guard, trained in part by the United States, had the sole purpose of protecting the presidency, and yet on July 26, 2023, they overthrew the democratically elected government. Guys, come on, you had one job. Meanwhile, critics say that the president of Niger was still basically under a form of French colonial rule. Now, 5 countries in Western and Central Africa have been seized by military juntas, and all 5 of them were former French colonies. But all hope isn't lost, because in response, a bloc of West African nations told the coup leaders that they have to reinstate the ousted president or face military intervention. It would be like if the Secret Service overthrew President Biden tomorrow, and then Mexico and Canada got together and said they were going to invade the United States to put Biden back in power. It's that exactly. The reason this is so concerning to the rest of the world is because in the past 18 months, Africa has experienced a wave of coups in Burkina Faso, Chad, Guinea, Mali, Sudan, and now Niger, leaving all of us to wonder what the heck is going on in Africa? What can the United States, France, and other Western countries do to prevent this coup from staying in power, if anything at all? And what is the Russian Wagner mercenaries' influence on all this? I'm your average infantryman, Chris Cappy, and today I'm going to try my best to untangle this big old cluster. Why do the events in Niger even matter to you and the rest of the world? Part of what makes Niger geopolitically important is they're the world's 7th largest producer of uranium that's used in nuclear power. They also have minerals and oil reserves, as well as a strategic role in the fight against Islamic militants. This makes them important to the United States, Europe, as well as China and Russia. Stability in Niger is also very important because they neighbor other key countries like Nigeria. If the majority of the continent of Africa is thrown into war, the vital mining and oil operations will shut down, and no one wants that. It's easy for someone with my level of understanding of geography to forget that the African continent is only separated from Europe at its closest point by just 14 kilometers, between Morocco and Spain. Because one of the concerns in Europe is that the instability and war in Africa will create a migration crisis, sending thousands of refugees their way. It's easy to forget that European countries often shoulder the burden of instability in places like Africa and the Middle East. For example, in 2015, 1.5 million war refugees fled to Europe from Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. Although migration from Africa to Europe is more difficult than from the Middle East due to the lack of a land bridge. France's colonial history with Niger began in 1922 as colonization spread east from the coast. It was this history of colonization that's part of the reason for the military coups in Africa today that are rejecting their relationship and ties with France and the West. Starting in the 1800s, France colonized almost all of Western Africa, and in all had their reach in 20 different African countries. But Niger's relationship with colonialism extended for a much longer period of time than many other nations. After World War II in the 1940s, when many nations were granted their independence, French President Charles de Gaulle chose not to grant independence to their West African colonies. It was only after the domestic attitudes in France changed in the 1960s that the independence was finally granted to Niger, along with other colonial countries. Only the thing for which you have struggled will last. Since formal independence from France in 1960, Niger's had a complicated relationship status with democracy. There have been 4 prior coup attempts in the country since then. However, Niger looked like they were putting all of that into the past, because in 2021, President Issoufou stepped down peacefully, and he allowed his predecessor, President Bazoum, to take the seat. Bazoum won 56% of the vote in February 2021, and the elections there were seen as widely free and fair. This peaceful transition of power was a major turning point. It was a big moment for Niger, and it was a hopeful sign that the country was moving in a more positive direction. Unfortunately, we're going to see not all was well behind the scenes. Because on early Wednesday morning, July 26, 2023, at 4:33 a.m., the Niger presidential office began making some really unusual posts on the social media platform formerly known as Twitter. The tweet read, The President of the Republic and his family are doing well. The Army and the National Guard are ready to attack the elements of the GP involved in this mood swing if they do not return to better feelings. That sounds pretty sus to me. What the heck's going on over there? Behind the scenes, a group of high-ranking military officers arrested the president at his palace, essentially holding him hostage. The junta called themselves the National Council for the Safeguard of the Homeland. For all the average infantrymen out there, junta means a military or political group that rules a country after taking power by force. Then, a spokesperson for the junta got on TV wearing the most strikingly blue blazer and said, quote, "The defense and security forces have decided to put an end to the regime you are familiar with." Instantly, nations around the world came together to condemn these actions as illegal. Later that morning, Niger's citizens in the capital of Niamey woke up to this news, and they responded with pro-democracy protests outside the presidential palace. Protesters at the French embassy set fire to a wall and waved Russian flags. There were cheers of "Long live Putin" alongside "Down to France." There's a battle between Russia and the United States for the people's support here. Eventually, gunfire from guards surrounding the palace dispersed the crowds. One of the key high-ranking coup leaders is Brigadier General Baroum. He's the chief of the Special Operations Forces in Niger. Surprisingly, he's been a beloved military commander by the United States military for many years. In fact, he trained at Fort Benning. Fort Benning, located in the great southern state of Georgia, is the same base I was trained at, and yet I don't think I could pull off a coup. And that's because he also got additional skills from an American school for foreign military officers, as well as training at the premier National Defense University in Washington, D.C. Wow, we really gave this guy the keys to the car. Basically, the US trained that army that overthrew the government that they were trying to protect. I get it, we all had that one guy in our platoon at Fort Benning who was constantly talking about mutiny. Guys, it would be so easy if we just took our M1 Abrams, marched on the White House, and then we could run this bitch the right way. I mean, I'd never do it, unless you guys were into it. I'm just joking, unless— No, I was Googling how to overthrow the government so I could stop people from overthrowing the government. Hey sir, what's a good ChatGPT prompt for how to convince the platoon to arrest the president? Is there a chance General Baroum might face direct combat with American troops? There are over 1,000 American soldiers stationed in Niger. The US probably doesn't want to use them though, because if an army foreign to the African continent restored order by force, it would greatly reduce the legitimacy of the president. Instead, the Pentagon has decided to keep those American soldiers in place. They haven't called them up to leave the country just yet either, but they're also not having them marching on the Capitol to reverse the coup. 1,000 soldiers likely wouldn't be enough to do that job anyway. Naturally, everyone hopes the coup leaders don't attack the American or French soldiers stationed there. It probably wouldn't be a very good idea for them anyway, since it would open the door for full-blown US intervention, which the coup leaders probably don't want. The United States spent over $100 million building an airbase in Niger's arid center in order to launch drones and special forces operations against Islamic terror groups operating in the region. America has also spent over $500 million since 2011 in training and fighting alongside Niger forces against terror groups. And this commitment inside Niger might have tied the US hands diplomatically, and might be why the US President Joe Biden and his administration are hesitant to label the Niger coup as a coup. That's because if they did, it might trigger an end to US security aid to Niger. The US often has to use verbal jujitsu when it comes to dealing with coups, like when President Obama refused to recognize the coup in Egypt in 2013. But that raises the question, why did this coup happen in Niger? What are the motivations of these coup leaders? Well, if we take them at their face value, the junta specifically cited security issues and bad governance as the driving purpose behind the coup. It is true, Niger has faced increasing jihadist attacks. They've dealt with an influx of 300,000 refugees from the terror attacks in Mali, putting increased pressure on them. 43% of all global terrorism deaths happen in the Sahel region where Niger is located. So if you agree with the coup leader, you can go vote for him. Oh wait, no, you can't vote under martial law. That's not how coups work. But on the other hand, reportedly only 10% of those terror attacks happen in Niger. And according to data gathered by the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, Niger has recently had a downtrend in extremist violence, when it lowered by 40% last year. Wait, so are you telling me the coup might have lied about why they forcefully took power? I refuse to believe it. There is some evidence to suggest that the security concerns are an excuse, and that the real actual reason for the coup is that there were tensions between elite military units and the government over pay and salary status. To put a point on it, the president who was thrown out of power was trying to cut those military soldiers' salary for 2 years because he didn't trust them, and I can't imagine why not. If I took control of the government by force, I'd do it different. I'd totally let the people have free elections, like immediately. Well, not immediately, but as soon as things were safe. And it couldn't be a rainy day. And Mondays wouldn't work either, because the other problem with this theory is that if security is really at the heart of the issue for why the junta took control, look at what happened in Mali following their coup and expulsion of French and UN troops. Not surprisingly, there was a surge in violence in Mali afterwards. So I think it might be possible that part of the reason violence increased in Mali after the French military left and Russian Wagner forces went in is because terrorism in Africa is sometimes misunderstood. Yes, there are certainly violent jihadist extremist groups there, for certain, but there are also groups that are fighting against what they believe is colonization, or governments that are still controlled by colonialism. So to these terrorist groups or insurgent groups, whether it's Wagner or French forces, they are going to be against that rule anyway. Part of the reason why it's argued that stability in Africa has been so difficult to achieve is because we don't have a good understanding of what exactly it is we're fighting against. Soldiers on the ground there, like your average American, French, or Russian soldier, Wagner mercenary, might not always have a strong grasp on the historical, political, and literal land minefield that they just stepped onto. For example, the countries in question today, like Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso, both the coup leaders and the insurgents' motivations have something in common. From their point of view, they're dealing with decades of weak governments characterized by corruption, impunity, and disorganization. And that's part of the reason why I think it's important for us to attempt to untangle the complexities, because you can't defeat what you don't understand. It's important that the average soldier have a grasp on the complexities of not only the motivations of terrorism in Africa, but also the motivations of the coup leaders. Another potential reason for the coup is food insecurity, because more than 80% of the 137 million Africans facing food insecurity are in conflict-affected countries. Niger's coup soldiers shut down the border and airspace, which cut off shipments of humanitarian aid like medicine and food that's desperately needed by the people in Niger. War and conflict continues to be the main reason for starvation in Africa, and 73% of the food insecurity is concentrated in just 8 countries. This includes South Sudan, Niger, Burkina Faso, where all these coups are happening. It's likely not a coincidence that the same place where people are having trouble getting food is where these revolutions are occurring. Russia's war in Ukraine has made food insecurity in Africa worse. 40 million innocent people in Africa are estimated to be affected by the lack of grain shipments from Ukraine. Another thing I think might be pushing these countries towards military coups is their rising energy prices. These cost increases were triggered by Western sanctions against Russian oil exports. What happened next was inflation went up on the African continent, wrecking their financial stability. To make matters worse, some countries in Africa then got their credit ratings downgraded. This was seen by unfair by the countries in Africa. So it's important for us to have some empathy here and understand why Africa might be upset with the West in order for the best way for us to fix those problems. So a possible reason for this coup could have to do with the resentment towards France, because even though Niger has a wealth of natural resources, they're still one of the poorest in the world. Whether it's fair or not to blame France for that, put all that on them, isn't really the point. Because from many people's point of view in Niger, they do blame France and what they think matters. According to an analyst from the Institute for Security Studies, even though France granted independence, the people of Niger believe they're still tied to France and that nothing happens in Niger without the approval of the French government first. One of the examples given is that Niger and 14 other nations in the continent use the Central African franc currency and are required to store 50% of their currency reserves with the Banque de France. There are 2 perspectives on this. One is that it helps promote economic stability in those countries, and the other is that it gives France economic control over them. Now, the true motivations behind the junta's decision to overthrow the government may never come to light. At this point, it's tough for us to say. There are claims of disinformation from Russia and from the United States. Regardless of the true reasons, there are powerful forces on the African continent that are preparing to reverse the coup and restore democracy. ECOWAS is threatening to restore order with military force. ECOWAS, or the Economic Community of West African States, was set up in 1975. It's made up of 15 different member states in Africa listed here, including Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Ghana. Together it has a population the size of about the United States with 380 million people. I think its goal is kind of similar to that of the EU. The stated goal of ECOWAS is to achieve collective self-sufficiency for its member states by creating a single large trade bloc, by building a full economic and trading union. After the long history of colonization in Africa, this group aims to not need intervention from outside the African continent. Most importantly to this story, though, ECOWAS also serves as a peacekeeping force in the region, with member states occasionally sending joint military forces to intervene in the bloc members' countries at times of political instability and unrest. This is why ECOWAS leaders announced an ultimatum: either return President Bazoum to power within a week or face all means necessary. It's not like ECOWAS is making empty threats either. They back up their promises to keep stability and democracy in the past. For example, in 2017, the leader in Gambia refused to step down from power after losing the elections. So ECOWAS sent 7,000 soldiers to mass at the border to Gambia. This pressure made the ruler of Gambia agree to step down and go into exile. But the problem is, it's going to take a lot more than 7,000 soldiers on the border with Niger to reverse the coup. However, the first weapon used here wouldn't necessarily be live bullets, because almost immediately after the start of the coup, ECOWAS announced crippling sanctions on Niger. The sanctions shut down 70% of the country's electricity supply. ECOWAS suspended all financial and economic trade with Niger, likely stopping 38% of their exports. This knee-jerk reaction drew some criticism from the international community. They were arguing that these actions do little to deter the military junta and actually just endanger the 4.3 million people in Niger that are reliant on humanitarian aid. There's evidence that this might not work because similar sanctions placed on Mali after their coup did nothing to deter the coup plotters and instead primarily hurt the citizens. Okay, if sanctions don't work, what about those bullets? According to DW News, any sort of military intervention in Niger would rely heavily on Nigeria. They share a 1,000-mile-long border, and Nigeria is not to be confused with Niger. Nigeria has 220,000 troops. It's the third largest on the continent. They have over 300 main battle tanks, 63 combat aircraft with F-7s. According to open source numbers, they have 300 artillery pieces. Of course, they couldn't send the entire military, but if they devoted just 25% of their forces, they would outnumber Niger's army. This, combined with a coalition force from the rest of ECOWAS, hardly makes this a fair fight. But there's a potential snag. They're fighting a militant Islamic movement called Boko Haram. So could Niger stand up to this alliance? Niger has 33,000 active duty forces. Their army has less than 200 lightly armored vehicles and less than 50 artillery pieces. With that alone, they would be in a lot of trouble. But it's not that simple, because there's another alliance forming up. The reason all of this could get messy very quickly is because Mali and Burkina Faso issued their own joint statement, warning that any military intervention against Niger's coup leaders would be considered a declaration of war against their own nations, potentially pitting Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger against ECOWAS. But how much would that really help Niger? Mali has a force of 21,000 soldiers and some Hind attack helicopters. Burkina Faso only has 7,000 troops and 5 combat aircraft. But it's not about simple number calculations, because the conflict could be horrible and messy at that point, something that ECOWAS wants to avoid. The attack would likely begin with an air campaign to test the resolve of the junta, and probably consist of the minimum level of deployment of troops that is needed to push the junta out of command. But the Niger coup has one more card up their sleeve. They can turn to Russia's Wagner private military company. A lot of people don't know about Russia's influence in Africa that has been growing since 2017. Wagner has gotten rich, offering security assistance in exchange for natural resource extraction. It's estimated Wagner earned $1 billion from resource extraction in the Central African Republic alone. They've been seen operating in both Sudan and Mali, where coups have occurred, and they've helped them stay in power. The US Department of State released a detailed report alleging that Prigozhin and Wagner manufactured an Africa-wide disinformation campaign aimed at the vulnerable sensibilities of colonialism in Africa. So the trauma of decades of colonialization is a powerful lever for Wagner to turn African nations away from the West and towards Russia. In doing so, Russia is able to isolate countries and make them dependent on Russia for security and trade in a tactic the International Monetary Fund calls state capture. Basically, Wagner is accused of taking control of their economy and shaping the government's decisions towards their advantage. Critics, on the other hand, will point out that they believe France and the United States is doing the exact same thing. Colonialism is a reality for many in the older generations. Remember, Niger's independence only came 62 years ago. Recent coups in Burkina Faso and Niger do not appear to have direct ties to the Wagner Group. However, local Niger reporters indicated that the junta are coordinating with Russia's Wagner Group to try to get assistance and security options. How the official Russian government feels about all of this is another story. There are unclear messages coming out of Russia right now, because we saw Prigozhin celebrated the coup, saying what happens in Niger is nothing other than the struggle of the people of Niger with their colonizers. Meanwhile, official messages from the Kremlin condemn the situation in Niger as a cause for serious concern. It's unclear why there are these conflicting messages. Maybe the Russian Federation isn't saying exactly what they mean, or maybe they are legitimately at odds with the message from the Wagner Group. If I were Putin, I would still be suffering from a little post-traumatic coup disorder at this point too, and probably wouldn't publicly be supporting a coup either. And yet you might be surprised to learn France still has a role in Niger today. Niger remains an important trading partner for France because they're one of the top uranium producers in the world. Over 1,500 French troops are currently deployed in Niger out of their air base in the capital. The Paris terror attacks in 2015 left 130 people dead and made authorities in France determined to destroy terrorist strongholds in Africa. We can't know the alternative history version of what would happen if France and the United States didn't send troops to help the security situation in Niger. For all we know, the extremists would have taken control of the nation long ago, or maybe without the US troops stationed there would have been no violence. We can't know for sure. But here's the thing, even if ECOWAS is successful at restoring President Bazoum to power, what does it say if his legitimacy rests upon the power of a foreign force? This coup is another reminder of how fragile democracy really is. It relies on the vigilance of all. I might stumble and put my foot in my mouth in my search for what's true, but I hope people understand that my goal here is to reach a better understanding of what's really happening. Obviously, this event is still a very dynamic and evolving situation, so I'd love to know what you guys' thoughts or takeaways from the coup is, and if there's anything interesting that I might have missed. Please let me know down in the comments section below, and until next time, I'm your average infantryman, Cappy. Thank you for watching.